The king thought exile was mercy, but for Sir Alec Arden it was a death sentence. Once he was the kingdom's greatest knight, loved by soldiers, praised by commoners, and admired even inside the royal court. But that admiration made King Cedric jealous, and soon Alec was framed for treason, stripped of everything, and sent to Blackwake, a cursed island where forgotten men were left to rot. No army, no allies, no way home, just black cliffs, freezing waves, and certain death. But Alec didn't die. Deep beneath that barren island, he discovered something no one in the kingdom understood. Something dark, valuable, and powerful enough to turn a grave into a weapon. The king thought he had buried his greatest knight, but he had only given him the one thing he needed, a place to build his revenge. The kingdom of Valerian had known peace for less than a year, and already its people were beginning to forget what peace had cost them. They had forgotten the frozen mountain passes where soldiers starved before they ever reached the battlefield. They had forgotten the crimson marshes of the Western Front, where armor sank into blood-soaked mud and arrows fell like black rain. They had forgotten the siege of Varick Fortress, when the enemy banner had nearly been planted over the walls until one knight, battered and half dead, led a charge so brutal that even veterans still spoke of it in lowered voices. But there was one name the people had not forgotten: Sir Alec Arden. He was not born a prince, he was not the son of a duke. He had no ancient bloodline powerful enough to bend the court around him. He had risen by merit alone through discipline, courage, and an almost frightening ability to remain calm when others broke. On the battlefield, he was a wall. In the capital, he was a legend. Soldiers respected him. Commoners adored him. Even among the nobles, where smiles were sharper than daggers, his name carried weight. That was exactly the problem. The first cracks appeared after the war. At every celebration, the cheers for Alec lasted longer than the cheers for the king. Ballads about the victory spread across taverns and plazas, but in most of them, the crown was only a distant symbol, while Alec Arden stood at the center, a living hero wrapped in steel and fire. Mothers pointed him out to their sons. Young knights copied the way he wore his sword. Even court ladies, women, who usually hid their thoughts behind veils and polished manners, allowed admiration to show when he entered a hall. King Cedric noticed everything. He noticed the way palace servants whispered when Alec passed. He noticed how the generals listened when Alec spoke, even after the king had already given an order. He noticed how one of the capital's most admired women, Lady Seraphina Vale, had smiled at Alec during the victory banquet. Not shamelessly, not flirtatiously, sincerely. For most men, that would have meant nothing. For Cedric, it meant humiliation. The king was not a fool, but he was vain, insecure, and painfully aware of the difference between inherited authority and earned respect. He sat on the throne because he had been born to it. Alec Arden stood above other men because he had bled for it. Cedric could command obedience. Alec inspired loyalty. That difference haunted him. And in a court already thick with jealousy, it did not take long for poison to find his ear. "Your Majesty," Lord Malrek said one evening, his voice smooth as oil, "a beloved knight is a blessing in wartime. In peace he can become something else." Cedric did not reply. So Malrek continued, "The people sing his name more loudly than yours. The soldiers trust him more than half your council. And now even the women of the court look toward him as though he carries the sun on his shoulders." The minister lowered his eyes just enough to appear humble. Admiration is harmless at first. Rebellion rarely is. That sentence stayed with the king. From then on, every harmless gesture became suspicious in his eyes. Every praise sounded like mockery. Every rumor became evidence. It was not difficult for men like Malrek to build a trap after that. The accusation came 3 weeks later. It began with a royal treasury convoy that was supposed to carry war reparations and captured enemy tribute from the northern garrison to the capital. The convoy never arrived. Its escorts were found dead in a ravine, the strong boxes broken open, the royal seal shattered. Worse still, among the wreckage was a folded military order bearing Alec Arden's name and a coded schedule of the convoy's route. By dawn, the palace was already whispering treason. By noon, Alec was summoned to the throne hall. He arrived in formal uniform, silver-trimmed black with the crest of the royal knights on his cloak. His sword was peace-bound at his waist by court decree. He walked through rows of nobles who watched with concealed excitement, as if they had all gathered for an execution but wished to pretend otherwise. At the far end of the chamber, under a canopy of crimson velvet and gold, sat King Cedric. The king's expression was cold. On the steps below the throne stood Lord Malrek, holding a sealed parchment like a priest presenting scripture. "Sir Alec Arden?" Cedric said, his voice echoing across the marble hall. "You stand accused of conspiring against the crown, arranging the theft of royal assets, and using your position to build unlawful influence among the army." Alec's face did not change. "That accusation is false." A murmur spread through the hall. Malrek lifted the parchment. "Your name was found among the evidence. Then my name was planted." "A convenient defense," Malrek replied. Alec's gaze shifted to him, a truthful one. Cedric leaned forward on the throne. "Do you deny sending orders to reroute the convoy?" "Yes." "Do you deny that soldiers loyal to you were assigned near its path?" "I deny that loyalty to me has anything to do with murder or theft." "Do you deny," Cedric asked, slower this time, "that your influence has grown beyond your station?" At that, the room fell still. Alec understood then. This was never about the convoy. The evidence, the accusations, the formal outrage, all of it was only decoration. The real crime was standing too high in the eyes of others, winning too much respect, being too visible, too useful, too admired. He looked not at Malrek, but at the king. And for the first time, he saw the whole shape of it. Not justice, fear. Alec drew a slow breath and spoke clearly enough for every noble in the chamber to hear. "If my service to the kingdom is now a threat to the throne, then the throne has chosen the wrong enemy." Several heads snapped up. One woman near the pillars covered her mouth. Malrek's eyes sharpened at once. Cedric's face darkened. "So even now," the king said, "you answer with pride, with truth, with insolence, with the same loyalty I gave you on every battlefield, while others hid behind walls." The insult landed harder because it was not shouted. Alec did not tremble or rage. He simply stood there, straight-backed and unbroken, speaking like a man who had nothing left to fear. Cedric hated him for it. "Enough," the king said. The word cracked through the chamber. Then came the sentence. Sir Alec Arden was stripped of title, land rights, military command, and honors. His crest was to be removed from all royal records. His name would not be spoken in court except as a warning. By decree of the crown, he would be exiled beyond the southern trade lanes to Blackwake Isle, a barren island used in older times for prisoners, debtors, and those whose deaths were more convenient than public. It was, in all but name, a death sentence. Still, Alec did not kneel. Two royal guards stepped forward to remove his ceremonial cloak. The first guard reached for Alec's brooch, but his hand did not stop there. He shoved Alec's chest, trying to force him backward in front of the entire court. Alec did not move. The guard's face tightened with embarrassment. He shoved harder. Still, Alec stood like iron nailed into stone. A few nobles smiled behind their sleeves. They wanted him humiliated. They wanted the great war hero dragged down like a criminal before their polished shoes. The second guard stepped in with a sneer. "Kneel properly when the king strips you." Then he grabbed Alec's shoulder. That was the mistake. Alec moved so fast the hall barely understood what happened. His chained hands rose just enough to catch the guard's wrist. He twisted once, not enough to break it, but enough to send the man crashing to one knee with a strangled gasp. The first guard drew his sword halfway. Alec's eyes shifted. The guard froze. Not because Alec was armed, because for one terrifying second, every soldier in that hall remembered the stories. Varric Fortress, the Western Marshes, the frozen pass where Alec had fought 3 enemy captains with a broken spear, and walked away covered in blood that was not his. "Draw it," Alec said quietly, "and make this a battlefield." The guard's fingers trembled on the hilt. The throne hall went completely silent. Even the nobles stopped smiling. Alec released the second guard's wrist. The man stumbled back, pale and furious, but alive. Alec had not attacked the crown. He had only reminded them that chains did not make him weak. King Cedric rose slightly from his throne, his face dark with rage. "You dare raise your hand in my hall?" Alec looked at the kneeling guard, then back at the king. "If I had raised my hand," he said coldly, "your guard would not still be breathing." A sharp gasp passed through the court. Malrek's smile vanished for the first time. Cedric's jaw tightened, but he did not order the guards to strike again. Not there. Not while half the soldiers in the chamber stared at Alec with awe instead of hatred. So the cloak was removed. But this time, the guards touched him carefully. The silver knight's brooch at his collar, granted after the fall of Vorik Fortress, was unclasped and dropped onto the marble floor without ceremony. The sound it made was small, but in the silence it felt like the closing of a tomb. From the edge of the hall, Alec caught a glimpse of Seraphina Vale standing among the court ladies. Her face had gone pale. She took one step forward, then stopped herself. To speak for him now would only drag her into the same pit. Alec gave the slightest shake of his head. "Do not." Her fingers tightened around her sleeves, but she obeyed. Malrek smiled faintly again, but this time the smile was thinner. By sunset, Alec Arden was in chains aboard a narrow prison vessel heading south through gray waters. The journey took 6 days. No one spoke much to him. The sailors had heard his name, of course. Some stared in awkward silence, struggling to match the condemned man before them with the war hero they had imagined. Others avoided his gaze entirely. It was easier to believe in treason than to think a kingdom would throw away its finest knight out of envy. The farther south they sailed, the harsher the sea became. By the morning of the 6th day, Blackwake Isle rose out of the fog, like the spine of a drowned beast. Dark cliffs, jagged stone, wind-beaten shorelines, not a single welcoming color anywhere. No green fields, no banners, no smoke from proper homes. Just black rock, white surf, and the ruins of an old watchtower rotting on a ridge above the coast. The captain unlocked Alec's chains and handed him a small bundle. Inside were a water skin, a knife, a coil of rope, a flint striker, and 3 stale loaves so hard they could have been masonry. "That's all?" Alec asked. The captain could not meet his eyes. Those were the king's orders. Alec stepped onto the wet stone of the shore. Behind him, the sailors lowered a small crate of useless supplies and shoved it into the shallows with a pole. No farewell was given. No priest spoke blessings. No last words were offered. The ship simply turned back toward the sea, its sail pulling away from the island, as if desperate to escape the fate it had delivered. Alec stood alone. The waves crashed hard enough to soak his boots. Salt wind dragged at his hair and clothes. Overhead, the sky hung low and iron gray, heavy with the promise of rain. He said nothing for a long time. Then he looked up at the cliffs, at the broken watchtower, at the barren ridges and narrow paths carved by time and storm. A grave. That was what Cedric had given him. Not exile, not punishment. A grave with an ocean around it. But Alec Arden had spent 2 long walking battlefields to lie down just because someone else had chosen where he was supposed to die. By nightfall, he found a hollow in the rocks, near the remains of an old storage shed. It offered poor shelter, but enough to keep the wind from stripping the heat from his body entirely. He inventoried the crate the sailors had left behind. A cracked pot, 2 coarse blankets, a rusted hand shovel, and 1 bent fishhook. Less than a prisoner deserved. More than a corpse would need. But Blackwake did not wait until morning to test him. The first attack came after midnight. Alec woke before the sound fully formed. Years of war had trained his body to recognize danger faster than thought. A scrape of claw on stone, a wet breath near the entrance, the slow, hungry shuffle of something that had smelled blood, sweat, and weakness. His eyes opened in the dark. At the mouth of the hollow, 2 shapes moved against the stormlight. Island wolves, not true mainland wolves. These were leaner, uglier things, half-starved from living on rats, seabirds, and whatever corpses the tide delivered. Their ribs showed through patchy gray fur. Their eyes burned yellow. Foam clung to one muzzle. Alec's sword had been taken. His armor had been taken. His title had been taken. but his hand still remembered war. The first wolf lunged. Alec rolled sideways, grabbed the rusted shovel from beside the crate, and slammed its bent edge into the animal's jaw. Bone cracked. The beast hit the wall, shrieking, but the second wolf was already on him. Its teeth closed around his forearm. Pain flashed hot and immediate. Alec did not shout. He drove his knee into its ribs, then smashed the shovel handle down across its skull, once, twice, 3 times. The hollow filled with snarls, blood, and the sharp stink of wet fur. The wounded wolf clawed at his leg. Alec kicked it back, seized the small knife from his bundle, and stepped forward. The wolves hesitated. That hesitation killed them. Alec moved with brutal efficiency. One slash opened the first wolf's throat. A hard stomp crushed the second's foreleg. When it tried to crawl away, he drove the knife down behind its skull and held it there until the body stopped shaking. Then silence returned. Only the sea kept roaring outside. Alec stood in the dark, breathing slowly, blood running down his arm and dripping from his fingers onto the stone. A weaker man would have taken it as a warning. Alec took it as inventory. Meat, fur, bones for tools. Proof that the island could bleed too. He dragged both carcasses deeper into the hollow, cleaned his wound with seawater despite the pain, and wrapped it tight with cloth torn from his sleeve. Then he sat beside the dead wolves until dawn, eyes open, knife resting across his knees. Blackwake had sent its first killers. Alec had turned them into supplies. The second day was spent searching for fresh water. The third, for anything edible. He found a narrow spring inland, half hidden behind a slope of sharp stone, and a cluster of scrub roots near the cliffs that were bitter but not poisonous. He caught 2 small crabs in a tide pool and ate them half-burned over a miserable fire. On the 4th day, he climbed the ridge near the old tower and saw more of the island, a crescent bay on the eastern side, a stretch of black stone shelves near the south coast and inland. Almost nothing worth naming. Thin soil, twisted brush, wind-carved rock. A death island indeed. But dead places still held secrets. It was near sunset on the 5th day when he first noticed it. He had climbed down toward the southern shelves where waves rolled in beneath the cliff in long, hissing bursts. The tide was low, exposing cracks in the rock and shallow basins where seawater shimmered in fading orange light. Alec almost missed it because at first it looked like shadow. A strange dark stain glistened between 2 fractured slabs of stone. He crouched beside it. The substance was thick, black, and slow-moving, bubbling faintly as it seeped from the rock itself. It gathered in a narrow pool before trailing toward the sea in oily ribbons. When Alec touched it, it clung to his fingers with greasy heaviness and a bitter, biting smell, unlike rot, salt, or anything natural he had encountered on campaign. He frowned. This was no ordinary mud. He looked higher along the crack and saw more of it leaking out in uneven beads, like the island itself was bleeding black tar from its bones. Any other man might have cursed it and moved on, but Alec had spent years around siege workshops, transport crews, and military engineers. He had seen pitch, lamp grease, axle oils, tar sealants for ships, and all manner of substances boiled, scraped, or traded for war. This was not the same as any of them, but it was close enough to stir a dangerous thought. He scraped some into the cracked pot and carried it back to his shelter. That night, under a hard wind and a thin flame, he began to test it. At first, it only smoked. Then it spat. Then the cloth wick he had twisted from his torn sleeve caught for half a second before choking out in a foul burst. Alec adjusted the wick, cleaned the pot's lip, and tried again. Smoke flooded the hollow, making his eyes burn. He coughed, cursed under his breath, and nearly knocked the whole thing over. On the 3rd attempt, the black substance ignited properly. A small, ugly flame rose from the improvised lamp. It was unstable, dirty, and sharp-smelling, but unmistakably alive. Alec stared at it. The little fire danced across the surface of that black liquid like a secret refusing to stay buried. His mind moved faster than it had in weeks. If it could burn, it could replace lamp oil. If it could be cleaned, separated, or thickened, It might serve even more uses. If there was enough of it beneath the island, he looked toward the darkness outside, past the broken stone mouth of his shelter, toward the cliffs where the black seep bled from the earth. Then slowly the first real smile since his trial appeared on Alec Arden's face. King Cedric had sent him to a grave, but buried under this dead island was something valuable enough to light cities. And if the world was foolish enough to cast him aside, then he would build a kingdom of his own from the filth no one else understood. The flame flickered in his eyes. Outside, the sea battered Blackwake Isle like it was trying to keep its secret. Inside, the exiled knight leaned closer to the burning oil and whispered the first words of the empire that would one day make kings bow. "Let's see," Alec said softly, "how worthless this island really is." The first thing Alec Arden learned was that discovery meant nothing without control. The black substance leaking from the cliffs could burn, yes, but barely. The flame it produced was unstable, thick with smoke, and foul enough to sting the eyes and throat after only a few breaths. It was not something any sane merchant would buy. Not yet. At most it was proof, a whisper of possibility, a promise hidden inside filth. And promises alone did not keep a man alive. By dawn, the little flame from the night before had died, leaving behind a greasy residue and a hollow stinking of bitter smoke. Alec sat in silence, staring at the blackened pot in his hands. His eyes were red from the fumes, and his sleeve, already torn from making the wick, was stiff with oil stains. Outside, the wind screamed along the ridges of Blackwake Isle, as if mocking him for finding hope too early. He ignored it. Hope was only useful when chained to effort. That morning, he returned to the southern stone shelves with the cracked pot, the rusted shovel, and a strip of cloth wrapped around his mouth. Under the low gray sky, the black seep was still there, oozing slowly from the fractured rock in dark, glistening lines. Now that he knew what to look for, he noticed more of it. Thin rivulets trailing through crevices, droplets clinging to the stone, shallow pools where the tide had not yet washed it away. Not one spring. Several. That mattered. He crouched low and began gathering it more carefully, scraping the thicker parts into the pot and leaving behind sand, shells, and bits of stone as best he could. It was miserable work. The oil clung to everything. It stained his fingers, ruined his grip, and carried a sharp mineral smell mixed with rot and sea salt. By the time the pot was half full, his hands looked as though he had dipped them in darkness. Still, he kept going. When he returned to the ruined shed near his shelter, Alec set the pot over a small fire and began his first true experiment. He had no proper tools, no metal coil, no sealed vessel, no distillation tower. What he did have was a soldier's patience, a battlefield engineer's memory, and the stubbornness of a man who had already lost everything worth taking. So he worked with what Blackwake had given him. He filtered the crude oil through scraps of cloth to remove the heaviest grit. He let it settle in the pot to see what sank and what floated. He skimmed the surface, separated the thicker sludge from the thinner liquid, and heated small amounts at a time, watching how each behaved. Most of the early attempts were disasters. One batch boiled too fast and spat burning droplets across the stone, forcing him to kick dirt over the fire before the whole shelter caught. Another produced such a choking cloud of smoke that he stumbled outside half blind, coughing hard enough to bring up blood. The third burned with a weak yellow flame for nearly a minute before suddenly flaring high and shattering the cracked pot with a dry pop. Alec looked down at the ruined pieces in silence, then he laughed once. Not because it was funny, because at some point, a man either laughed at misfortune or let it crush him. "Fine," he muttered hoarsely. "Again." So he started again. The next few days became a brutal rhythm of labor. Wake before sunrise, search for water, check crude collection points, gather fuel for the fire, scrape more seep from the rocks, experiment, fail, adjust, repeat. He made new containers from clay-like earth he found near a stream bed inland, shaping rough bowls and jars with his hands and hardening them beside carefully managed heat. Most cracked, some held. He scavenged strips of corroded metal from the ruins of the watchtower and bent them into crude supports. He split the old blankets apart for fibers, He cut his remaining loaves into tiny pieces and rationed every bite with a discipline that bordered on cruelty. There were moments, especially at night, when the truth of his situation pressed in harder than the cold. He was alone on a dead island, covered in soot and oil, living on crabs and roots, trying to turn black slime into something useful with tools that barely deserve the name. In the capital, warm halls still glowed beneath chandeliers. Cedric still sat on his throne. Malrek still whispered in velvet rooms. The court still ate from silver and spoke of law, while the man they condemned nearly suffocated over a smoking clay bowl. A lesser man might have broken there. But Alec had not survived war by measuring suffering. He survived by moving forward one task at a time, until pain became background and only purpose remained. On the 9th day after his discovery, he made real progress. The crude oil he collected varied slightly from seep to seep. Some was thicker, nearly tar-like. Some was thinner and more fluid. That alone told him something important. Whatever lay beneath Blackwake was not uniform. If he separated what he gathered more carefully, he might isolate the portions that burned better. So he began collecting from different cracks in separate containers. He marked them with scratches on the clay. 1 line for the eastern shelf, 2 for the southern basin, 3 for the narrow cliff split near the broken tide marker. He heated each sample slowly and tested them one by one. The eastern oil smoked too much. The southern oil burned too violently, but the third, taken from the cliff split, burned lower, steadier, and longer than the others. Alec watched the wick carefully. The flame was still crude, still ugly, but it no longer coughed itself to death in seconds. It held. It trembled in the windless corner of the shelter, but it held. For nearly 12 full minutes. He did not move until it went out. Then he looked at the remaining oil in the bowl and felt something cold and sharp settle into place inside him. This was no longer desperation. This was the beginning of a process. Over the next week, he improved it. He filtered the thinner oil multiple times through layers of cloth, ash, and fine sand. He let the heavier impurities settle longer. He used lower heat and longer waiting times. He tested thicker and thinner wicks. He shaped better lamp cups from the strongest clay. Slowly, painfully slowly, the results improved. By the end of that week, Alec had managed to produce 3 small jars of lamp fuel that burned badly by civilized standards, but reliably enough to matter. The smoke was still there, though reduced. The smell was harsh, but tolerable in open air. The flame was not elegant, but it was stronger than animal fat lamps of similar size, and the burn time was better than the tallow scraps Blackwake's old stores had yielded. It could be sold. That thought changed everything. Until then, his work had been survival. Now it became business. The difference was enormous. Alec stood on the eastern ridge at dawn, looking over Blackwake's coast with narrowed eyes. The island was still barren, still merciless, but it was no longer merely a place to endure. It was an asset, a source, a secret, and secrets became power only when traded correctly. The first problem was obvious. Blackwake had no market, no village, no port authority, no caravans, no local buyers. If he wanted coin, he needed ships. For the next several days, Alec divided his time between refining oil and watching the sea. Blackwake lay beyond the kingdom's favorite routes, but not entirely beyond traffic. Fishermen sometimes drifted farther south in lean seasons. Smugglers used forgotten waters when they wished to avoid customs. Small merchant cutters occasionally gambled on shortcuts between minor ports. None came close enough to the island willingly, not unless forced by weather or desperate need. But Alec only needed one. On the 4th day of waiting, he got his chance. A narrow 2-masted vessel appeared at midday, limping along the coast under reduced sail. Even from the ridge, Alec could see something was wrong. The ship rode unevenly in the water, and several crewmen were working frantically near the stern. It did not look like a military patrol. Too small, too worn. Most likely a private trader or smuggler trying to avoid notice. Alec moved at once. He grabbed one of the clay fuel jars, wrapped it in cloth, and ran down the ridge path toward the eastern shore where the beach widened enough for a cautious landing. By the time he reached the coast, the vessel had already dropped anchor in shallow water and lowered a boat. 3 men came ashore. They were armed, rough-faced, and suspicious before their boots even touched stone. One wore a sailor's coat patched so many times it looked more stitch than fabric. Another had a scar running from ear to collar. The third, clearly the later, had the careful eyes of a man who counted profit before risk and blood before trust. When he saw Alec standing on the shore in torn clothes and oil-stained hands, he frowned. "Well," the man said, "either this island grows knights now, or the dead have learned posture." Alec did not smile. "Depends what you're buying." The sailors exchanged glances. The leader stepped closer. "You live here?" "For now. Then you're either mad or very hard to kill. Both have kept me alive." That earned the faintest twitch at the corner of the man's mouth. "My ship took damage in the rocks 2 nights ago," the sailor said. "We need fresh water, maybe timber if the island somehow grows miracles, and lamp oil if you have any." His eyes swept over Alec's ragged shelter in the distance. "Though I'm guessing you don't." Alec lifted the wrapped jar in one hand. "I might." That brought silence. The sailor stared. "From where?" Alec looked past him toward the cliffs. "From Blackwake." One of the others barked a laugh. "What? Do you squeeze it out of the stones?" "In a way." Before Alec could lead them inland, the scarred sailor stepped closer and looked him over with open contempt. "Captain," the man said, "why are we bargaining with him? He's alone." The leader's eyes narrowed slightly. "Careful, Rusk." But Rusk had already mistaken torn clothing for weakness. He stepped into Alec's space and reached for the wrapped jar. "Let's see what the dead knight is hiding." Alec's hand closed around his wrist. The movement was calm. The pressure was not. Rusk's grin disappeared as Alec's fingers tightened like an iron clamp. The sailor tried to pull free. Alec turned his wrist outward, shifted his foot, and slammed him face first into the whetstone with one clean motion. The other sailor drew a knife. Alec kicked the fallen man's blade from his belt, caught it in the air, and pointed it at the second sailor's throat before the man completed his step. Everything stopped. The waves crashed behind them. The leader slowly raised one hand, not to Alec, but to his own crew. "Put it away," he said. The second sailor swallowed and lowered his knife. Alec released Rusk only after the man stopped struggling. The scarred sailor rolled onto his back, coughing seawater and blood from a split lip. Alec looked down at him. "I am selling fuel," he said, "not begging for mercy." Rusk glared, but he didn't stand. The leader studied Alec with new interest. The torn clothes, the oil-stained hands, the hollow eyes from smoke and hunger, those had hidden the man underneath. Now he saw him properly, not a castaway, not a prisoner, a trained killer standing on his own shore. The leader's smile returned, slower this time. "Well," he said, "that answers one question." Alec lifted the jar again. What question was that? Whether Blackwake's only resident was worth robbing. Alec's gaze did not move. "He isn't." The man laughed once and gestured toward the rocks. "Then show me this miracle fuel, sir, not a beggar." Alec led them a short distance inland where the wind was weaker, set the jar on a flat stone, and fitted a cloth wick into the shallow mouth. Then, without ceremony, he struck flint and lit it. The flame rose in a low amber tongue. Not pretty, not clean, but strong. The sailors leaned in. The leader sniffed, grimaced at the smell, then watched the flame hold steady through the breeze. "How long?" he asked. "This amount," Alec said. "Long enough to justify paying for it." The sailor crouched, studying the burn like a priest examining a relic. "It smokes. Less than fish fat. It stinks. Less than rotting whale oil." The second sailor grunted. "He's not wrong." The leader stood and folded his arms. "How much do you have?" "3 jars ready. More if I choose to make them." "If you choose." Alec met his eyes. "You're not negotiating with a beggar. You're negotiating with the only man on this sea who can sell you fuel from a dead island." That did it. The leader laughed, short and sharp with genuine surprise. "There is a spine under all that soot after all." He introduced himself as Bram Voss, captain of the Morning Tide, a small, independent trader with no questions he could not afford answered. He had come close to Blackwake by necessity, not courage, after a storm and a damaged stern lamp left his crew half-blind at sea. Under normal circumstances, he would never have bought fuel from a stranger marooned on cursed rock. But necessity, Alec knew, was the mother of every profitable bargain. Bram tested the fuel himself that evening aboard his vessel. He burned one jar through the ship's stern lamp and used part of another in a lantern below deck. The smoke annoyed him. The smell annoyed everyone. But the fuel worked. By morning, he returned to shore with the expression of a man who had found value in a place he did not trust. "I'll buy the lot," Bram said. "For what price?" Bram named a number so insulting it almost became impressive. Alec looked at him in silence for 3 full seconds, then turned as if to walk away. "Hold," Bram called. "You haven't even countered. I don't bargain with men who mistake exile for desperation." Bram's eyes narrowed. "And what do you mistake it for?" "Leverage," Alec said without turning. "You need fuel now. I need coin once. Only one of those needs repeats." That made Bram pause. The captain was not dealing with a stranded fool. He was dealing with a man who understood scarcity, urgency, and pride well enough to weaponize all three. After a longer exchange, they settled on a fairer price. Not generous, but real, enough to matter. When Bram dropped the small leather pouch of silver and copper into Alec's hand, the weight of it felt heavier than coins should. It was the first money Alec Arden had earned since the day the kingdom cast him away. Not by title, not by royal favor, not by the sword, by the black blood of Blackwake. Bram also sold him extras before leaving. 2 intact clay jars, a better knife, a bundle of coarse cloth, dried meat, nails, lamp hooks, and most precious of all, a length of narrow copper tubing from damaged ship stores that the captain had considered worthless scrap. Alec did not react visibly when he saw it, but inside something tightened with focus. Copper meant refinement. Refinement meant improvement. Improvement meant scale. Before departing, Bram gave him one final look. "You know what happens if word spreads about this place?" "Yes." "Men will come." Alec closed his hand around the coin pouch. "Then I should be ready before they do." Bram smirked. "You talk like you plan to own the island." Alec looked up at the black ridges rising behind him, at the cliffs that had nearly become his grave, at the cracked stone bleeding wealth no one else had recognized. Then he answered, calm as ever, "I plan to build something the kingdom will regret losing." The morning tide sailed before noon. Alec stood on the shore until it vanished into mist, then turned back toward his shelter with supplies under one arm, silver at his belt, and the copper tubing gripped like a promise. The island no longer felt silent. It felt waiting. That night, he spread everything he had gained across the stone floor of the ruined shed and began planning in earnest. Better storage, more collection points, a larger fire pit, clay settling basins, improved lamps, a real distillation attempt. Perhaps if he could shape the copper properly and seal the clay well enough. A crude condenser. He barely slept. At dawn, Alec climbed once more to the southern cliffs where the oil seeped from the stone. He stood there in the cold morning wind, staring down at the black liquid gathering in the cracks. And for the first time, he did not see survival. He saw industry, furnaces, workshops, barrels, docks, ships lined in harbor waiting for fuel, coins pouring into hands that had once scraped roots from hard soil. He saw Blackwake transformed. And as the first pale light of day touched the dark rock, Alec crouched beside the largest seep yet, pressed his fingers to the warm black flow, and smiled. This island had paid him once. Next time, it would pay enough to hire men. And once men came, Blackwake would never belong to the king again. Coin changed the way Alec Arden looked at the island. Before Bram Voss arrived, Blackwake had been a prison made of wind, salt, and stubborn endurance. Every cliff was an obstacle. Every path was a burden. Every day was measured by what little he could drag from the land without dying. Now he saw the island differently. The ridges were watch points. The coves were future docks. The clay beds inland were not mud, but material. The black seep in the southern cliffs was no longer a curiosity. It was a vein of power. And power, Alec knew, was meaningless unless it could be organized. That was why the silver from the morning tide mattered more than the food or tools Bram had sold him. Those could keep him alive a little longer. The money, however, meant leverage. It meant that when another ship appeared, he would not be standing on the shore like a starving castaway with a single dirty jar in his hand. He would be ready. For the next several days, Alec worked with a purpose sharper than hunger. The copper tubing Bram had called scrap became the center of his attention. It was narrow, slightly bent, and stained green in places from long neglect, but it was intact enough to matter. Alec cleaned it with sand, seawater, and a knife until the worst corrosion came away. Then he began designing, in the roughest possible terms, a primitive refining setup. He did not need elegance. He needed separation. The crude oil from the cliffs was too raw to build a real trade on. It burned, yes, but unpredictably. Some batches smoked heavily. Others flared dangerously. If he wanted repeat buyers, he needed consistency. Something that could be produced the same way, sold the same way, and trusted enough that merchants would return rather than curse his name across every port from here to the capital. So he built his first still. It was laughably primitive by any scholar standards. A broad clay pot for heating, a fitted lid hammered together from salvaged metal strips and packed with wet clay to reduce leakage, the copper tube fixed through one side and at the far end, a smaller receiving vessel half buried in cool, wet sand to encourage condensation. It looked less like a triumph of engineering and more like a drunk blacksmith's apology. But Alec had seen war machines made from worse. The first test nearly killed him. He heated too fast. Pressure built under the sealed lid, and before he could pull back, the wet clay around the seam burst with a wet crack. A spray of hot vapor and oil splattered across the stones, and Alec threw himself sideways just in time. The edge of the burst clipped his left forearm, burning a strip of skin red and angry from wrist to elbow. He rolled, cursed, and lay there breathing hard, while black smoke crawled upward into the cold air. Pain pulsed through his arm. Slowly, Alec sat up and stared at the wreckage. Then he laughed under his breath. Again, that was becoming a habit on Blackwake. Too tight, he muttered. Too hot. Too fast. He reworked the setup that same day. This time he left a small vent gap, reduced the seal, cooled the receiving vessel better, and fed the fire in slower increments. The process took longer, painfully longer, but when the first thin stream of condensed liquid finally slid through the copper tube and dripped into the waiting clay cup, Alec felt a sharper thrill than he had when he made his first sale. Because this was different. The earlier fuel had been scraped from chance and filtered through effort. This, if it worked, was refinement. He waited until the cup held a shallow pool, then let the apparatus cool before testing it. The liquid was lighter than the raw crude, thinner. It still carried a harsh smell, but not the same suffocating heaviness as before. Alec soaked a new cloth wick, placed it in a lamp bowl, and lit it. The flame rose cleaner. Still rough. Still imperfect, but cleaner. It burned brighter than the crude fuel he had sold to Bram, with less smoke and a steadier body to the flame. Alec watched it for a long moment, then looked back toward the southern cliffs. The island had just become much more valuable. Over the next 2 weeks, his work changed pace entirely. No longer was he merely testing whether Blackwake's oil could be useful. He now knew it could. The question had become, how much could he produce before exhaustion, weather, or lack of labor crushed the opportunity in its cradle? That answer, unfortunately, was not much. Alec could collect crude alone. He could refine alone. He could shape clay vessels, maintain fire, monitor burns, and watch the sea alone. He could not do all of it well at the same time and continue expanding. Blackwake needed hands. That realization came with both opportunity and risk. More people meant more production. More production meant more sales. But more people also meant less secrecy. On a different kind of story, that might have frightened him. Here, Alec simply accepted it as the next unavoidable stage. No business grew from one man clutching a secret in a cave forever. Sooner or later, he would need workers. The key was choosing men with nowhere better to go, and every reason to stay loyal. Blackwake, fortunately, was the sort of place desperate men already drifted toward when the world had no use for them. The first arrived by accident. A fishing skiff nearly shattered itself against the eastern rocks during a storm, and Alec spotted it from the ridge just before dusk. He ran down the rain-slick path with rope tied around his waist and found 2 men half drowned in the surf, dragging themselves in a damaged cargo bundle toward shore. One was old, broad-shouldered, and gray-bearded, with hands like split oak and a face carved by years of hard labor. The other was younger, thinner, and clearly too weak from hunger to stand without swaying. Alec helped them into the ruined shed without asking questions first. Only once they had heat, dry cloth, and something hot in their stomachs did he begin learning who they were. The older man's name was Garin Hale. He had once been a shipwright in the western docks of Ilarion, respected enough to oversee hull repairs on military vessels until a royal tax official accused him of withholding materials. Whether the accusation had been true or not hardly mattered now. He had lost his workshop, his license, and eventually his home. Since then, he had drifted from port to port doing repair work for smugglers, fishermen, and anyone willing to ignore his record. The younger man was called Thomas, a dock laborer's son who had followed Garin after famine and debt stripped his family of everything else. Their skiff had been trying to cut south toward a minor island port when the storm pushed them off course. "You realize where you landed?" Alec asked once Garin had regained enough strength to sit upright. The older man glanced around the shelter at the clay jars, the soot-dark walls, the strange metal piping, and finally at Alec himself. On cursed rock by the look of it. Blackwake. Thomas paled immediately. Garin only grunted. "Thought so." Alec studied him. "You don't seem surprised. I'm too tired to waste fear." That answer earned him a measure of respect. When morning came, Alec brought Garin and Thomas to the southern shelves. He showed them the black seep. He showed them the crude collection pits he had dug and lined with stone. Then he showed them the still. Garin stared longest at that. He walked around it once, slow and silent, then crouched beside the clay base and tapped the fittings with a rough knuckle. His brows drew together, not in ridicule, but in the sort of professional offense a craftsman felt when seeing something ugly that nonetheless functioned. "You built this?" Garin asked. "Yes, with no proper forge?" "Yes, with almost no tools." "Yes." Garin stood and looked at him fully for the first time. "Then you're either gifted or insane." Alec gave the same answer as before. Both have been useful. For the first time, the old shipwright barked a dry laugh. That laugh mattered more than either man realized. Because once Garin stopped looking at Blackwake like a cursed grave and started looking at it like a problem to be solved, the island changed again. He saw what Alec had seen. Not ruin. Structure waiting to happen. The damaged skiff could be cannibalized for wood and nails. The eastern cove could, with work, support a landing platform. The shed could be reinforced. Storage pits could be dug. Rain catchments could be improved. Barrel frames, racks, shelves, and support braces could be built if only the materials were gathered properly. In exchange for food, shelter, and a cut of future profits, Garin agreed to stay. Thomas followed without protest. Just like that, Alec Arden had his first men. The three of them fell into a brutal but efficient rhythm. Alec oversaw oil collection, testing, and negotiations whenever ships appeared. Garin repaired and reinforced everything that touched human hands. Thomas carried water, clay, firewood, and crewed under ceaseless instruction from both men, until his arms shook by sunset every day. The work was merciless. Blackwake was not gentle to those who tried to tame it. One day, the southern paths became slick with sea spray and nearly sent Tomas over a cliff with a load of crude jars. Alec caught him by the collar at the last second, dragged him back, and said only one thing: "Slow hands live longer." Another day, a clay vessel burst during heating and scorched part of the shed wall black. Twice, strong winds nearly ruined the cooling process for the refined batches. And always there was the smell, the clinging, bitter scent of oil and smoke that seemed to soak itself into skin, cloth, even sleep. Yet the island was changing. By the end of the month, the ruined shed had become a true workshop. Not a grand one, not yet. But it had reinforced beams salvaged from the skiff, raised storage shelves, improved fire pits, better clay molds, and 2 functioning stills instead of 1. Garin reshaped Alec's original design with a craftsman's eye, widening the heating basin slightly, stabilizing the copper support, and creating a better cooling trench for the receiving vessel. The results were immediate. Production increased, quality improved, waste dropped. Alec began separating output into grades. The best refined batch became lamp fuel. The heavier, dirtier residues he set aside and experimented with as grease. That second idea came from memory. During campaign seasons, he had watched supply crews fight endlessly with wagon axles, hinges, pulleys, and metal fittings that wore down too quickly under bad maintenance and cheap lubricant. Animal fat spoiled, poor tar mixtures stiffened or failed under strain. If Blackwake's heavier oil fractions could be thickened and blended into something useful for mechanisms, carts, or ships, then his value to buyers would double. The first grease batches were crude, black, and ugly enough to offend civilized eyes, but when Garen smeared a little over the rusted hinge of the old store hatch and worked it back and forth, the result was immediate. The hinge stopped shrieking. Garen lifted a brow. "Well," Alec crouched beside him. "Well?" The old shipwright tested it again, then nodded slowly. "It's filth, but useful filth. On Blackwake, that counted as praise." The island's next buyer came sooner than expected. Bram Voss returned. This time, the morning tide approached Blackwake with less caution and more calculation. The captain had spread word sparingly, careful enough not to trigger a rush of bigger predators too soon, but not careful enough to keep his own curiosity from bringing him back. When he stepped ashore and saw not one half-starved exile but 3 working men, stacked jars, reinforced structures, and smoke rising from organized fire pits, his expression changed from amusement to professional concern. "You move quickly," Bram said. "I move because I have reason to," Alec replied. Bram eyed the rows of clay vessels. "How much?" Alec gave him the number. The captain actually whistled. "That much from this rock?" "Enough for your lamps," Alec said, "and enough to make you money reselling in ports that ask fewer questions than the capital." Bram's grin sharpened. "There it is. I was wondering when the knight would learn commerce. I learned it the day I understood loyalty doesn't pay wages." That line stayed with Bram longer than Alec intended. The captain tested the new fuel and immediately saw the difference. It still was not noble house quality, but it was significantly cleaner than before. More importantly, Alec now offered 2 products instead of 1. Refined lamp oil and thick black lubricant, useful for ship fittings, pulley assemblies, and damaged gear housings. Bram bought all of it. Not cheaply either. Alec negotiated harder this time. He now had labor, better output, and proof of repeat quality. Bram tried his usual tricks, but Alec had already learned the captain's habits. The false sigh before a low offer, the little pause when something mattered more than he wanted to admit, the way his eyes flicked towards scarcity before agreeing. By the time the deal closed, Bram was still smiling, but it was the smile of a man who knew he had not won. In return, Alec bought smarter. Not luxuries, not comfort. Assets, hammerheads, fish hooks, rope, more cloth. A shovel that was not already rusting into uselessness. 2 metal hoops for reinforcing larger barrels. A whetstone, salt, grain, dried beans, a real handsaw. And, most importantly, word. "Bring me men," Alec told Bram as the cargo was exchanged. Bram arched a brow. "What kind?" "Not thieves who think one night's theft makes them kings. Not drunkards who'd burn the place down by accident. I want men with skills, or men desperate enough to respect structure. That narrows the ports considerably." "Good. I'm not building a tavern. I'm building an industry." Bram leaned against a crate, studying him with frank curiosity now. "You really intend to turn Blackwake into something?" Alec's gaze shifted to the ridges above them, where the evening wind rolled over black stone and unfinished paths. "No," he said quietly. "I intend to turn it into somewhere the kingdom cannot ignore." Bram said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once. When the morning tide sailed away again, it carried more than cargo. It carried the first real whisper of Blackwake's worth. And whispers, Alec knew, were dangerous things. The first real threat came 3 nights after Bram's second departure. It did not come with banners, it came with oars wrapped in cloth. Alec was awake when he heard them. Soft splashes below the eastern cove, too controlled for fishermen. too careful for lost sailors. He stepped outside the workshop, oil lamp covered in one hand, knife in the other, and looked down toward the black water. A boat slid between the rocks. Then another. 6 men climbed onto the shore. They carried short blades, hooks, and empty sacks. Raiders, not soldiers, not merchants. Just hungry men who had heard enough whispers to believe Blackwake held something valuable, but not enough to understand who guarded it. Alec woke Garen with one touch to the shoulder. "Get Thomas behind the storage pit," he whispered. Garen saw the figures below and cursed under his breath. "How many?" 6. Against 3? Alec's eyes remained on the cove. Against Blackwake. The raiders moved toward the workshop, low and fast. Their leader pointed at the stacked jars near the outer wall. One man reached for them. That was when Alec kicked over the first prepared clay bowl. Oil-slick sludge spilled across the path. The raider stepped into it and lost his footing instantly. Before he could shout, Alec came out of the darkness and drove the shovel handle into his throat. The man dropped without a sound. The second turned. Alec hit him with the lamp. The covered flame shattered against the ground, igniting the thin oil trail Alec had laid earlier that evening for testing drainage. Fire crawled across the stones in a sudden orange line, cutting the raiders from their boats. Panic broke their formation. Garen appeared from the side with a shipwright's mallet and smashed one attacker's knee sideways. The crack was ugly. The scream was worse. Thomas, shaking but determined, hurled a clay jar from behind the storage pit. It broke against another raider's chest, splashing him with thick black residue. The man staggered backward, clawing at his eyes. Alec moved through them like a ghost from an older war. One raider swung a hook at his face. Alec ducked, stepped inside the ark, and drove his knife into the man's shoulder, twisting just enough to disable the arm without killing him. Another tried to rush from behind. Alec caught the movement by sound alone, pivoted, and slammed his elbow into the man's nose. Blood burst across the firelight. The leader shouted, "Kill him! It's just one night!" Alec looked at him through the smoke. That was the worst thing he could have said. For a moment, Alec was no longer on Blackwake. He was back at Varek Fortress, standing amid broken shields and burning ladders while enemy soldiers screamed his name in fear. The raider leader charged. Alec let him come. At the last second, he shifted left, caught the man's wrist, and used his own momentum to throw him into the burning oil line. The leader crashed hard, rolled away from the flames, and came up screaming with one sleeve burning. Alec stepped on his sword hand. The blade clattered free. Then Alec placed the knife under his chin. "Who sent you?" The raider leader spat blood. "No one. Heard there was oil, thought island rats would be easy." Alec leaned closer. "You found the wrong rats. By dawn, 2 raiders were dead, 3 were bound, and 1 had escaped into the sea with burns on his arm and terror in his lungs." Alec let that one go. Garen noticed. "You missed him?" the old shipwright asked. Alec watched the fleeing boat vanish into morning fog. "No, then why?" Alec wiped blood from his knife. "Because fear travels faster than trade." The bound raiders stared at him in silence. That morning, Alec made new rules for Blackwake. No worker slept without a weapon nearby. No storage stayed unguarded. No path remained unprepared. No boat approached without being seen. The island was no longer just a workshop. It was becoming a fortress. That night, after the fires had dimmed and Thomas had finally fallen asleep where he sat, Garen remained outside the workshop, sharpening tools beneath the glow of one of the refined lamps. Alec stepped out beside him. For a while, neither man spoke. The sea crashed below the cliffs. The lamp burned steadily. Blackwake smelled of salt, clay, smoke, blood, and oil. Finally, Garen said, You know they'll come harder once word spreads. Yes, merchants first, then smugglers, then men with seals and titles who decide what you built should belong to them. Yes, and when they do, Alec looked down toward the southern shelves where the black seep still bled from the stone in endless slow patience. When they do, he said, they'll find this island already has an owner. Garen studied him in silence, then gave one slow nod. Not to a noble, not to a commander, to a man worth following. Above them, Blackwake's winds howled over the dark ridges like the island itself had begun to awaken. And for the first time since his exile, Alec Arden was no longer merely surviving on cursed land. He was building the foundation of power. One worker, one sail, one furnace, one weapon, one flame at a time.